My husband terrorized our son to toughen him up. I made his mother terrorize him instead. My son Leo was 8 years old and the sweetest kid you could meet. He loved dinosaurs and building things with blocks, and would tell anyone who listened about every type of train that existed. I worked nights at the hospital, and my husband Brett worked regular hours at the bank, so he handled bedtime and homework. Everything seemed fine until Leo started having accidents at school. The teacher called saying Leo wet himself during math class and wouldn't say why. Then Leo stopped talking about trains. He stopped building things. He started flinching when Brett walked into the room. I asked Brett what was going on, and he said Leo was getting soft and needed to grow up. Brett said his dad raised him tough and he turned out successful. I asked what he was doing, and Brett said he was just teaching Leo to be a man. One night I came home early from my shift because we were overstaffed. I heard Leo crying from his room and Brett yelling. I walked upstairs and found Brett holding Leo's dinosaur collection over the trash can. Brett was making Leo watch while he threw them away one by one because Leo cried during homework. Leo was sobbing and begging, and Brett kept saying tears are for babies. I grabbed the trash can and told Brett to stop. Brett said I was undermining his parenting and making Leo weak. The next day, Leo's teacher called again. Leo had hidden under his desk when she raised her voice to the class. She asked if everything was okay at home. I said yes because I didn't know what else to say. That night, I told Brett he couldn't discipline Leo anymore. Brett laughed and said I wasn't even home most nights, so how would I know what Leo needed? He said his methods were working because Leo stopped talking back. Leo never talked back before either, but Brett didn't care. I started switching my shifts to days, but Brett would find other ways to mess with Leo. If Leo took too long eating dinner, Brett would take his plate away and make him go to bed hungry. If Leo made any noise while Brett watched TV, Brett would take away his toys for a week. If Leo asked for help with homework, Brett would tell him stupid kids don't deserve help. Leo started hiding in his closet when he heard Brett's car in the driveway. I tried talking to Brett's family, but his mother Janet said Brett was raised the same way, and he went to college and got a good job. She said I was too soft, and that's why Leo was having problems. Brett's brother Kyle said it wasn't his business, but kids needed structure. Brett's dad Robert just said boys needed strong fathers. Everyone acted like I was overreacting to normal parenting. That's when I decided to show them what their normal parenting created. I started with Janet. Every time she called, I'd tell her Brett did something embarrassing. Brett clogged the toilet at work. Brett cried during a movie. Brett couldn't figure out how to use the new coffee maker. All lies, but Janet believed them because why would I make that up? She started calling Brett asking if he was okay, if he needed help, if something was wrong with him. Brett got frustrated and asked why she kept checking on him. Janet said I told her he was struggling with basic things. Brett confronted me and I said I was just keeping his mother informed like a good wife. Next was Robert. I called him crying, saying Brett couldn't perform in bed and asking if that was how Robert raised him. Robert was so uncomfortable he hung up. Then I called back and left a message saying Brett wet the bed after a nightmare. Robert never called our house again and started avoiding Brett at family dinners. Then I moved on to Kyle. I told Kyle that Brett had been borrowing money from me because he messed up at work and might get fired. Kyle told their whole family at Sunday dinner. Brett had to spend an hour explaining that he wasn't getting fired and didn't need money while everyone stared at him with pity. The final move was Thanksgiving. The whole family was there and Brett was telling Robert about a promotion he was up for. I interrupted and said we needed to talk about Brett's anger issues first. I told everyone how Brett threw Leo's toys away, how he made our son go hungry, how he called our 8-year-old stupid. Brett said I was lying, but Leo was sitting right there shaking. Janet asked Leo if it was true and Leo just started crying. Brett tried to say Leo was being dramatic, but everyone could see how scared Leo was of his own father. Robert stood up and grabbed Brett by the collar. Robert's hand twisted Brett's collar and slammed him against the wall next to the china cabinet. Plates rattled inside. Brett's hands came up, but Robert pushed harder, his face red and twisted. Kyle half stood from his chair, then sat back down. Janet had her hand over her mouth. Brett's wife's parents stared at their plates. Brett tried to say something, but Robert cut him off with a shove that made Brett's head bounce off the wall. Robert's voice came out low and mean, nothing like his usual careful way of talking. He said he raised Brett to be strong, but instead he made a coward who picks on little kids. He said real men protect people smaller than them. They don't make them scared to come home. The whole table sat frozen like someone hit pause on a movie. Brett's face went from red to white. Robert let go and stepped back, and Brett slumped against the wall. Nobody moved or spoke. The dining room felt too small and too hot. I grabbed Leo's hand and pulled him up from his chair. He was still crying, these quiet hiccup sobs that made my chest hurt. I needed to get him away from all the staring and the shouting and Brett's face. I walked Leo toward the hallway bathroom and he pressed against my side. His whole body was shaking. Behind us, the adults started talking all at once, voices overlapping and getting louder. I closed the bathroom door and locked it. The noise from the dining room turned into muffled sounds. Leo stood in the middle of the small bathroom with his arms wrapped around himself. Tears ran down his face and dripped off his chin. His breathing was fast and shallow. I knelt down in front of him and he wouldn't look at me. He stared at the floor tiles and kept crying. I asked if he was okay and he nodded but kept crying harder. I reached out to touch his shoulder and he flinched. My hand froze in the air. He thought I was going to hurt him. My own son thought I was going to hurt him. I put my hands down and just stayed kneeling there. I asked if he wanted to sit down and he shook his head. I asked if he wanted some water and he shook his head again. Then his voice came out tiny and broken. He asked if he was in trouble, if everyone was mad at him, if he did something wrong. I felt like someone punched me in the stomach. He spent months thinking he deserved everything Brett did to him. Months of believing he was the problem, that he wasn't good enough, that if he just tried harder or cried less or talked less or ate faster or stayed quieter, then Brett would stop. He carried all that weight thinking it was his fault. I told him no, he wasn't in trouble. None of this was his fault. He did nothing wrong. But he just kept crying and asking if Daddy was mad at him now. Someone knocked on the bathroom door. Janet's voice came through asking if we were okay. I didn't answer. She knocked again and said she needed to talk to Leo. I looked at Leo and he looked terrified. I unlocked the door and opened it a crack. Janet stood there with her makeup smeared from crying. She asked if she could come in. I didn't want to let her, but Leo was still her grandson. I opened the door wider and she came in and closed it behind her. The bathroom felt even smaller with 3 people. Janet looked at Leo and her face crumpled. She knelt down on the tile floor in her nice dress and got at Leo's eye level. She asked him if what I said at dinner was true, if his daddy really did those things. Leo looked at me and I nodded. He looked back at Janet and nodded too. His bottom lip was shaking. Janet asked if Brett threw away his dinosaurs. Leo nodded. She asked if Brett took away his food. Leo nodded again. She asked if Brett called him stupid. Leo's face twisted up and he started crying harder. He whispered that he tried to be good but nothing was ever good enough. No matter what he did, Brett got mad. He tried so hard but he kept messing up. Janet reached out like she wanted to hug him but stopped. Her hands dropped to her sides. She looked at me and her whole face changed, like she finally saw what I'd been trying to tell her for months. Like the blinders came off and she couldn't pretend anymore. She told Leo she was sorry, that she should have listened, that she should have protected him. Leo just cried. Janet stood up slowly and left the bathroom. I heard her heels clicking down the hall toward the dining room. More shouting started up. I helped Leo wash his face with cool water. His hands were still shaking when he dried them on the towel. I told him we were leaving. He grabbed my hand and held on tight. We walked back through the dining room where everyone was still arguing. Brett saw us and started to say something, but Robert stepped in front of him. I grabbed my purse from the hall table and Leo's coat from the closet. Brett pushed past Robert and followed us toward the front door. He was saying, "Wait, and we need to talk, and I'm still his father." Robert grabbed Brett's arm and yanked him back. Brett tried to pull away, but Robert was bigger and stronger. They started shouting at each other. I got the front door open and the cold air hit my face. Leo ran down the porch steps still holding my hand. I heard Robert yelling at Brett to stay inside. Brett yelling back that I can't just take his son. Robert saying Brett lost the right to call himself a father. I walked Leo to the car in the dark parking area. My hands shook trying to get the keys out of my purse. I unlocked the doors and helped Leo into his booster seat in the back. He was still crying quietly. I buckled him in and he grabbed my sleeve. I told him we were going home and he'd be safe. The front door of the house opened and Brett came out onto the porch. Robert was right behind him. Brett started down the steps, but Robert grabbed his shoulder and spun him around. They faced each other on the porch and I could see Robert's mouth moving. Brett tried to push past him, but Robert blocked the way. I got in the driver's seat and started the car. My whole body was shaking. I backed out of the driveway and Brett and Robert were still on the porch. Brett's face was red and twisted. Robert had his arms crossed. I drove away and checked the rearview mirror. Leo was curled up in his booster seat with his arms around his knees. I asked if he was okay, and he didn't answer. I turned onto the main road and headed home. The drive took 20 minutes and Leo didn't make a sound. When we got home, I parked in the garage and helped him out of the car. He held my hand walking into the house. I locked the door behind us and turned on the lights. Leo stood in the living room looking small and lost. I asked if he wanted dinner, but he shook his head. I asked if he wanted to watch TV, and he shook his head. I asked what he wanted, and he whispered that he wanted to sleep in my bed. I said okay, and we went upstairs. He changed into his pajamas and climbed into my bed. I got in next to him and he curled up against my side. Every few minutes, he'd start to fall asleep and then jerk awake. His body would go tense and his breathing would speed up. Then he'd realize where he was and relax a little. This kept happening over and over. I stayed awake watching him. Around 3 in the morning, he finally fell into deep sleep. His breathing evened out and his body went slack. I lay there in the dark, listening to him breathe. The next morning, I called the hospital and told them I was sick. My supervisor sounded annoyed but said okay. I called Leo's school and said he wouldn't be in. Then I called our pediatrician and asked for an urgent appointment. The receptionist said they could fit us in at 2. I made breakfast, but Leo barely ate. He sat at the table pushing cereal around in his bowl. I asked how he slept and he shrugged. I asked if he wanted to talk about yesterday, and he shook his head. We spent the morning watching cartoons on the couch. Leo sat pressed against my side the whole time. At 1:30, we got in the car and drove to the doctor's office. The waiting room had bright posters and a toy corner. Leo didn't want to play with the toys. He sat in the chair next to me and stared at his shoes. The nurse called us back and took Leo's height and weight and temperature. Everything was normal. The doctor came in and smiled at Leo. She asked him some questions about school and his favorite subjects. Leo gave short, quiet answers. Then she asked me to step out while she examined him. I waited in the hallway for 15 minutes. When she called me back and Leo was sitting on the exam table looking at the floor. The doctor said physically Leo was fine. No signs of injury or illness. But she noted that he showed signs of anxiety, trouble sleeping, changes in appetite, withdrawn behavior, fear responses. She wrote down a name and number on a prescription pad, a child therapist who worked with kids who went through trauma. She said I should call today and get Leo in as soon as possible. I took the paper and thanked her. We checked out at the front desk and walked to the car. My phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out and saw 17 missed calls from Brett. I'd put my phone on silent after we got home last night. There were also 12 text messages. I didn't read them. We drove home and I made Leo lunch. He ate a few bites. My phone rang again. Brett. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again 2 minutes later. Again 5 minutes after that. I finally answered on the 6th call. Brett started yelling before I could say anything. He said I embarrassed him in front of his entire family, that I turned everyone against him with my lies, that his own father wouldn't talk to him now, that his mother was crying and his brother wouldn't return his calls. I waited for him to finish. Then I said we needed to talk about Leo, not about his feelings. Brett said there was nothing wrong with Leo until I started filling his head with garbage. I said Leo was terrified of him and that couldn't continue. Brett's voice went cold. He said Leo was his son too, and I couldn't keep him away. I told him he couldn't see Leo until we figured things out. Brett said he'd call the police for parental alienation, that I was breaking the law. His voice had that edge it gets when he's about to lose control, that tight, angry sound that used to make me try to calm him down. I hung up. My hands were shaking. I stood in the kitchen staring at my phone. Then I called Georgia from work. She answered on the second ring and asked what was wrong. I told her everything. The Thanksgiving dinner, Robert grabbing Brett, leaving with Leo, Brett's calls. Georgia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a second. Then she said her sister went through a bad divorce 2 years ago. Her sister's ex was controlling and mean. Not physical, but emotionally harsh. Georgia's sister got a lawyer who helped her get custody and a restraining order. His name was Thomas Cummings, and he was tough but fair. Georgia said she'd text me his number. I thanked her and hung up. The text came through a minute later. I called Thomas Cummings' office and explained the situation to his assistant. She said he had an opening Monday morning at 9. I took it. That gave me the weekend to get ready. I spent Saturday and Sunday researching custody law on my laptop while Leo watched TV. I made lists of every incident I could remember. The dinosaurs in the trash, the dinners taken away, the homework where Brett called Leo stupid, the times Leo hid in the closet, the accidents at the school. I wrote down dates as best as I could remember them. I wrote down what Brett said and what Leo did. I filled 6 pages in a notebook. Leo came into the kitchen Sunday afternoon while I was writing. He stood in the doorway watching me. Then he asked where his dad was, if he was coming home. My chest got tight. I told him Daddy needed some time to think about how he'd been acting, that Daddy needed to work on some things. Leo's face did something complicated. Relief and guilt mixed together. He looked like he felt bad for being relieved, like he thought he should want his dad to come home, but he didn't. It broke my heart. I told him it was okay to feel however he felt, that none of this was his fault. He nodded but didn't look convinced. He went back to the living room and I kept writing. Monday morning, I got to Thomas Cummings' office 15 minutes early. The building was downtown near the courthouse, all glass and steel with a fancy lobby. I sat in the waiting room with my notebook clutched in my lap, watching other people come and go. A woman with a black eye checked in at the desk. A man in a suit talked loudly on his phone about custody percentages. At 9 sharp, the receptionist called my name and led me down a hallway to Thomas's office. He was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with gray starting at his temples and reading glasses pushed up on his head. He shook my hand and gestured to a chair across from his desk. I sat down and he asked me to start from the beginning. I told him about Leo's accidents at the school, about finding Brett throwing away the dinosaurs, about the dinners taken away and the homework sessions where Brett called our son stupid, about Leo hiding in the closet when he heard Brett's car. Thomas listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I got to Thanksgiving and Robert grabbing Brett, Thomas looked up and asked if anyone recorded it. I said no. He asked if I had any documentation of Brett's behavior toward Leo, any texts or emails where Brett admitted what he was doing, any photos of Leo's face when he was scared, any recordings of Brett yelling. I stared at him and realized I had nothing. 6 pages of handwritten notes in a spiral notebook that I could have made up yesterday. No proof except my word and Leo's fear. Thomas saw my face and said it was okay. We could work with testimony. He asked about the school. Had Leo's teacher documented the accidents and the hiding under the desk? I said I thought so, but I wasn't sure. Thomas wrote something down and said he'd request Leo's school records. Then he asked about the lies I told Brett's family. I explained the whole thing. The calls to Janet about Brett struggling with basic tasks. The message to Robert about Brett wetting the bed. Telling Kyle that Brett needed to borrow money. Thomas stopped writing and looked at me. He said those actions, while they exposed the truth at Thanksgiving, could be used against me in court. Brett's lawyer would argue I was deceptive and manipulative, that I deliberately alienated Leo from his father by turning the family against Brett with false stories, that if I lied about those things, maybe I was lying about Brett's treatment of Leo too. My stomach dropped. I said I was just trying to show them what their parenting methods did to Brett. Thomas said he understood, but the law didn't care about my intentions. It cared about my actions, and my actions looked like parental alienation. He asked if I'd kept Leo from seeing Brett since Thanksgiving. I said yes. Thomas closed his eyes for a second and said that made it worse. I felt sick. I'd been so focused on protecting Leo that I didn't think about how it would look in court. Thomas said we needed to be strategic going forward. Everything I did from now on had to be documented and justifiable. No more keeping Leo from Brett without a court order. No more manipulation tactics even if they worked before. We needed to build a case on facts, not revenge. Wednesday afternoon, I took Leo to his first appointment with Alexis Hardy. Her office was in a small building near the hospital, painted yellow with a garden out front. Inside the waiting room had toys and books scattered on low tables. Alexis came out to meet us, and she was exactly what Leo needed. Warm smile, soft voice, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of formal clothes. She knelt down to Leo's level and asked if he liked dinosaurs, pointing to his shirt with a T-Rex on it. Leo nodded without looking at her. Alexis said she had some dinosaur toys in her office and asked if he wanted to see them. Leo glanced at me and I nodded. He followed Alexis through a door and it closed behind them. I sat in the waiting room staring at magazines without reading them. A clock on the wall ticked. Another parent came in with a little girl who immediately started playing with blocks. I wondered what Leo was telling Alexis. If he was talking at all or just sitting there silent. If he was drawing pictures of Brett yelling or throwing toys away. If he was crying. The session was supposed to last 45 minutes, but it felt like hours. Finally, the door opened and Leo came out holding a small plastic stegosaurus. Alexis smiled at him and said he could keep it. Then she asked if I could stay for a few minutes while Leo played in the waiting room. We went into her office and she closed the door. The room had a desk, but also a play area with toys and art supplies. Alexis sat in a chair and gestured for me to sit across from her. She said Leo was a sweet kid who was trying very hard to be good. I said I knew. Alexis said Leo showed signs of something called complex trauma, that he'd learned to expect punishment for normal kid behavior, and now he was constantly monitoring himself to avoid making mistakes. She called it learned helplessness. Leo believed nothing he did mattered because he'd get in trouble anyway, so why try? She recommended twice-weekly sessions and said recovery would take time, maybe years. I asked if he'd be okay, and Alexis said kids were resilient, but trauma didn't just disappear. We had to give Leo space to be a kid again without fear. Teach him that mistakes were normal and didn't result in punishment. Help him understand that his dad's behavior wasn't his fault. I nodded and tried not to cry in front of her. Alexis handed me a tissue anyway and said it was okay to feel overwhelmed, that I was doing the right thing by getting Leo help. But all I could think about was how I should have done this months ago. How I let Brett hurt our son because I didn't want to believe it was that bad. How I focused on managing Brett instead of protecting Leo. The weight of it pressed down on my chest and I couldn't breathe right. Thursday evening, I was at work when my phone rang. I was in the middle of checking a patient's vitals, so I let it go to voicemail. 10 minutes later, it rang again. Same number I didn't recognize. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway to check the message. It was my neighbor Carol from 2 doors down. She said Brett had been at my house pounding on the front door for 20 minutes. That Leo was inside with Georgia and Brett was yelling for them to let him in. That she almost called the police but wanted to check with me first. My hands went cold. I called Georgia immediately and she answered on the first ring. She said Brett showed up around 6 and started banging on the door demanding to see Leo. That Leo heard his voice and ran to hide in the closet. That Brett was screaming about his rights as a father and how I couldn't keep his son from him. Georgia said she didn't open the door and Brett finally left about 10 minutes ago. She asked if she should call the police and I said no, not yet. I told her to keep all the doors locked and not let Leo out of her sight. Then I called my supervisor and said I had a family emergency. She wasn't happy, but she let me leave early. I drove home going 10 over the speed limit the whole way. When I got there, Brett's car was gone, but I could see Georgia's face in the window watching for me. I parked and ran inside. Georgia met me at the door and said Leo was still in the closet. I found him curled up in the back corner behind my winter coats, hugging his knees. I sat down on the floor next to him and said it was okay. Daddy was gone. Leo asked if he was coming back and I said not tonight, but I knew Brett would keep trying. That he wouldn't just accept being kept away from Leo. That I needed to formalize our separation immediately before this got worse. Friday morning, I called Thomas from my car before my shift started. I told him about Brett showing up at the house and pounding on the door while Leo was inside. Thomas asked if I had any proof, and I said my neighbor heard it and Georgia was there with Leo. Thomas said that was good. We could use their statements. He said he'd file for emergency temporary custody and a restraining order that day, that we'd request a hearing as soon as possible. I asked how long that would take, and Thomas said probably 2 weeks. 2 weeks of constantly looking over my shoulder. 2 weeks of keeping Leo away from his own home because Brett might show up. 2 weeks of wondering if Brett would try something else. Thomas said in the meantime I should document everything. Every call from Brett, every time he showed up somewhere, every threat he made. Take photos if possible. Get witness statements. Build a paper trail that showed he was dangerous. I said okay and hung up. Then I sat in the hospital parking lot trying to calm down enough to go inside and do my job. The hearing room felt too small with Brett's lawyer spreading papers across the table like he owned the place. Thomas sat next to me with Leo's therapy folder and the pediatrician's report, and I watched Brett's lawyer stand up and start talking about how I manipulated everyone. He said I coached Leo to act scared. He said taking away toys and enforcing bedtime rules was normal parenting that every father did. He said I was twisting discipline into something it wasn't because I wanted to punish Brett for being a strong parent. Thomas opened the therapy folder and started reading Alexis's notes out loud. Leo showed signs of complex trauma. Leo had learned helplessness responses. Leo's anxiety spiked whenever he heard raised voices or saw his father. The pediatrician's notes said Leo's bedwetting started after months of emotional stress at home. Brett's lawyer kept interrupting and saying therapists write what parents tell them to write. He said of course Leo was anxious because I told him his father was dangerous. He said the real abuse was me keeping a son away from his dad. The judge looked tired and asked Thomas if he had anything else. Thomas pulled out the school counselor's reports about Leo hiding under desks and refusing to go home. He showed the neighbor's statement about Brett pounding on the door while Leo hid in the closet. He presented Janet's written account of Thanksgiving and what she saw when Leo started crying. Brett's lawyer objected to all of it and said hearsay couldn't prove anything. The judge held up her hand and said she'd heard enough for now. She granted me temporary custody and said Brett could have supervised visits at a family center twice a week. I felt my chest tighten because supervised wasn't the same as none. Thomas leaned over and whispered that courts move slowly, and this was actually a good outcome. I wanted to scream that any outcome where Leo had to see Brett felt like losing. The judge set another hearing date for 3 months out and said she expected both parties to follow the order exactly. Brett stared at me from across the room with his jaw clenched. I gathered my papers and Thomas walked me toward the exit. Brett caught up with us in the parking lot before we reached my car. His face was red and his fists were tight at his sides. He stepped close enough that I could smell his cologne and told me I'd regret destroying his relationship with Leo. Thomas moved between us and said Brett needed to back away. Brett ignored him and kept talking, saying I turned everyone against him and made Leo think his own father was a monster. I wanted to tell him he did that himself, but my voice wouldn't work. Thomas pulled out his phone and said he'd call the police if Brett didn't leave immediately. Brett finally walked away but kept looking back at us. I got in my car and sat there shaking for 10 minutes before I could turn the key. The whole drive home I kept checking my mirrors to make sure Brett wasn't following me. That night I spread all my bills across the kitchen table and tried to make the numbers work. The mortgage was due in 2 weeks. Leo's therapy appointments cost $120 each even with insurance. Thomas's retainer ate through my savings and now he wanted another $3,000 for the next phase. My hospital paycheck covered maybe 60% of what I needed each month. I pulled up my bank account and stared at the balance dropping lower every week. I tried cutting expenses, but we were already eating cheap meals and I couldn't cut Leo's therapy. I looked at my credit cards and calculated how long I could float on borrowed money before everything crashed. The spreadsheet showed red numbers no matter how I rearranged things. I sat there until 2 in the morning trying to find money that didn't exist. Georgia called me the next day during my lunch break and asked how the hearing went. I told her about the supervised visits and the money problems. She was quiet for a minute, then said she'd watch Leo during my night shifts for free until I got stable again. I started crying right there in the hospital cafeteria, because I'd been so focused on fighting Brett that I forgot other people might actually help. Georgia said her kids were grown and she had the space and Leo was a good kid who deserved someone looking out for him. I thanked her about 15 times before she laughed and told me to stop. That afternoon, I switched back to night shifts because they paid more, and now I had childcare covered. The visitation center called to schedule Leo's first visit with Brett. I marked it on the calendar and felt sick every time I looked at the date. The morning of the visit, I woke Leo up early and told him we had to go somewhere. He asked where, and I said he was going to see his dad for a little while. Leo's whole body went stiff and he grabbed my arm. He begged me not to make him go. He said he'd be good and do all his homework and not make any noise. I knelt down and promised I'd be right outside the whole time. Leo started crying and saying he didn't want to see Daddy. I had to pry his fingers off my sleeve and walk him to the car while he sobbed. The drive to the visitation center took 20 minutes, and Leo didn't say a single word. He just stared out the window with tears running down his face. We walked inside and a supervisor met us in the lobby. She had a kind face and introduced herself, but I don't remember her name. She explained the rules to Leo about staying in the room and how she'd be there the whole time. Leo looked at me, and I said I'd be waiting right in the lobby. The supervisor took Leo's hand and led him down the hall. I watched him look back at me 3 times before they turned the corner. I sat in the lobby reading the same magazine page for 30 minutes. Then the supervisor came back with Leo and said the visit ended early. Leo ran to me and wrapped his arms around my waist. The supervisor pulled me aside and said Brett spent the entire visit lecturing Leo about being strong. She said Brett told Leo that crying was for babies and real men don't show fear. She said Brett completely missed the point of why supervision was ordered in the first place. I asked if Leo had to go back and she said that was up to the judge, but she'd be filing a report. Leo didn't let go of me until we got home. 2 days later, Alexis called and asked me to come in without Leo. I drove to her office after work and she sat me down with a serious expression. She said Leo was getting worse instead of better. He'd started wetting the bed again after being dry for weeks. He was having nightmares about disappointing his father. He told Alexis he tried really hard not to cry during the visit, but he couldn't help it. Alexis said the supervised visits were making Leo's trauma worse and she was worried about his progress. I asked what I should do and she said she'd write a letter to the court recommending visits stop until Brett completed therapy himself. She said Leo needed time to heal without being forced to face the person who hurt him. I called Thomas from the parking lot and told him everything. Thomas filed an emergency motion to suspend Brett's visitation until he finished parenting classes and anger management. Brett's lawyer fought back hard with his own motion claiming I was using therapy reports to turn Leo against his father. The lawyer said I was engaging in parental alienation and that keeping Leo away from Brett would cause permanent damage to their relationship. He argued that supervised visits were already in place and that was enough protection. The judge read both motions and ordered a full custody evaluation instead of ruling immediately. She said a neutral expert needed to assess the situation and make recommendations. Thomas explained that meant another few months of waiting while someone investigated our whole lives. The evaluator would interview everyone and write a report that could determine Leo's future. I felt exhausted just thinking about it. The custody evaluator reached out 3 days later. Her name was River Sanford, and she had a calm voice on the phone. She said she'd need to meet with me, Brett, Leo, and anyone else who had relevant information. She'd observe Leo in different settings and review all the records from therapy and court. Then she'd write a report telling the judge what custody arrangement served Leo's best interests. She scheduled my interview for the following Tuesday at her office. I wrote down the address and tried not to think about what Brett would tell her, or whether she'd believe me about what really happened. Tuesday morning, I drove to River's office in a building downtown that smelled like coffee and air freshener. The waiting room had uncomfortable chairs and magazines about parenting that made me want to throw up. River called me back at exactly 9 and led me to an office with a desk covered in folders and a box of tissues on the corner. She had gray hair pulled back and wore glasses that she kept adjusting while she talked. She explained how the evaluation worked and said everything I told her would go in her report to the judge. I sat down and started from the beginning with Leo's accidents at the school and how Brett said he was making Leo tough. River wrote in a notebook without looking up much. I told her about the dinosaurs in the trash and Leo hiding in his closet and going to bed hungry. I explained how Brett's whole family thought his methods were normal because Robert raised them the same way. River kept writing and her face didn't change at all. I couldn't tell if she believed me or thought I was making things worse than they were. After 2 hours, my throat hurt from talking, and River still had more questions. She asked about my work schedule and whether I ever saw Brett hit Leo. I said no hitting, but the emotional stuff was just as bad. River wrote that down too. She asked if I coached Leo about what to say, and I felt my face get hot. I told her I never put words in Leo's mouth and everything he said came from him. River nodded and made another note. By the time we finished, it was almost noon, and I had no idea whether the meeting helped or hurt our case. River said she'd schedule time with Leo next and walked me to the door without giving anything away. 2 days later, I brought Leo to River's office for his first session. He held my hand tight in the waiting room and asked if he had to talk about Daddy. I said River just wanted to get to know him and play some games. River came out with a soft voice and told Leo her office had toys and art supplies. Leo looked at me, and I nodded that it was okay. River took him back while I sat with those parenting magazines again. 50 minutes felt like 5 hours. When they came out, Leo was carrying a drawing of a dinosaur, and River said he did great. She scheduled another session for the following week. In the car, Leo asked if he said the right things, and I told him there were no right or wrong things, just the truth. The second session went longer, and when Leo came out, he looked tired. River asked to speak with me privately for a minute. She said Leo was very cooperative, but she needed to interview Brett and his family members before forming conclusions. My stomach dropped because I knew Brett would lie and make himself sound reasonable. River must have seen my face because she said she'd been doing this work for 15 years and knew how to spot inconsistencies. That didn't make me feel better. A week later, Thomas called saying Brett's lawyer contacted him about settlement options. They wanted to discuss terms before River finished her report. Thomas said that meant Brett's interview probably went badly, and his lawyer knew how he'd look on paper. I asked what kind of settlement they wanted, and Thomas said he'd find out more. The idea of settling made me nervous because it meant Brett might get more access to Leo than a judge would give him. Thomas said we didn't have to agree to anything, and this was just his lawyer testing the waters. I told Thomas to find out what they were offering, but I wasn't making any promises. The school counselor called me at work 3 days later during my shift. She said Leo had a major meltdown in class when his teacher raised her voice at another student. Leo crawled under his desk and wouldn't come out for 20 minutes. The counselor sat with him until he calmed down, but she thought I should come get him. I told my supervisor I had a family emergency and left the hospital right away. Leo was waiting in the counselor's office with red eyes and his backpack clutched against his chest. He didn't say anything on the drive home. That night he asked if he was broken and why he couldn't just be normal like other kids. I held him and said his brain was protecting him from scary things and it would get easier with time. He fell asleep in my bed again. The next morning, my supervisor pulled me aside before my shift started. She said she understood I was dealing with a difficult situation, but I'd used most of my leave time in the past 2 months. She wasn't threatening my job, but she wanted me to know I needed to be careful about absences going forward. I thanked her and felt panic rising in my chest. If I lost my job, I couldn't pay for Leo's therapy or the lawyer or the mortgage. Everything was balanced on me keeping this job, and Leo kept having emergencies that required me to leave early. I didn't know how to be in 2 places at once. Thomas called a few days later saying River had interviewed Janet. He said Janet told River about Thanksgiving and admitted she defended Brett's parenting because that's how Robert raised their sons. Janet apparently said she realized after seeing Leo's fear that maybe those methods caused more harm than she wanted to admit. Thomas said River seemed impressed by Janet's honesty. I felt something loosen in my chest because having someone from Brett's family acknowledge the truth meant I wasn't crazy or overreacting. Maybe River would see that this wasn't about me being vindictive, but about Leo actually being hurt. River tried to schedule an interview with Robert, but he refused to participate. Thomas said that actually helped our case because his silence suggested he knew his parenting methods were harmful. River noted in her report that Robert declined to be interviewed despite multiple requests. I wasn't surprised he wouldn't talk. Robert never admitted being wrong about anything, and facing questions about how he raised Brett would force him to look at his own choices. Brett started posting things on social media about parental alienation and false accusations. He didn't name me directly, but everyone knew what he meant. The posts talked about fathers being pushed out of their children's lives by vindictive mothers and how the system was biased. Several mutual friends reached out asking what was really going on. Some seemed genuinely concerned, and others felt like they were fishing for gossip. I started writing responses explaining my side, but deleted them before posting. I wanted to defend myself and tell everyone what Brett did, but I didn't know if that would make things worse. Thomas called after seeing Brett's posts and said I needed to stay off social media completely. Anything I posted could be used against me in court, and engaging with Brett's narrative would make me look equally unstable. He said the best thing I could do was stay quiet and let River's evaluation speak for itself. I deactivated all my accounts that afternoon. It felt like losing my voice, but Thomas was right that nothing good would come from fighting with Brett online. Without social media, I felt even more cut off from the world. Most of my friends were people I only talked to through those apps, and now I had no way to reach them. My younger sister called 2 days later. We hadn't spoken in almost 4 years after a fight about our parents. She said she saw Brett's post through a mutual friend and wanted to check if I was okay. I almost hung up, but something made me stay on the line. She said our father was exactly like Brett, and she wished someone had protected us the way I was protecting Leo. Her voice cracked when she said it, and I started crying for the first time in weeks. All the fear and exhaustion and anger came out while my sister listened. She said she was proud of me for getting Leo away from Brett, even though it was hard. After we hung up, I sat on the bathroom floor and cried until my head hurt. I didn't realize how much I needed someone to say I was doing the right thing. Leo's therapy session ran longer than usual that week. When I picked him up, he was quiet in the car, staring out the window with his dinosaur backpack clutched on his lap. I asked if he wanted to talk about it, but he just shook his head. That night, he came into my room around midnight, crying, and told me he wished he had a different dad. Then he immediately started apologizing, saying he was bad for thinking that. I held him and tried to explain that wanting to feel safe didn't make him a bad person, but I could see the guilt eating at him. He thought the whole custody battle was his fault because he couldn't be good enough for Brett. The next morning, I called Alexis to tell her what happened. She said Leo was taking on blame for Brett's choices, which was common in kids who experienced this kind of treatment. She wanted to work with him on separating his father's actions from his own worth, but she warned me it would take time. I thanked her and hung up feeling like I was watching my son carry a weight he should never have to lift. Thomas called 3 days later while I was restocking supplies at the hospital. His voice sounded different, more energized than usual. He said River finished her evaluation and submitted it to the court that morning. He got a copy and wanted me to come to his office as soon as possible to go over it. I told my supervisor I had a family emergency and left immediately. The drive to Thomas's office took 20 minutes but felt like hours. I kept thinking about what River might have written, whether she believed me or thought I was overreacting like Brett's family did. Thomas's office was in a converted house downtown with creaky floors and mismatched furniture. He met me at the door and led me to his desk where a thick report sat in a manila folder. He opened it and started reading key sections out loud. River recommended I retain primary custody with Brett, only getting therapeutic visitation after he completed parenting classes and individual therapy. Her report detailed Leo's trauma responses, the way he flinched at raised voices and hid in closets. She wrote that Brett showed no ability to recognize his behavior as harmful and blamed me for turning Leo against him. Thomas looked up and said this was strongly in our favor, but Brett's lawyer would fight the recommendations hard. I asked what that meant, and he explained that Brett could file motions to dismiss the report or argue River was biased. Courts usually gave weight to evaluator recommendations, but nothing was guaranteed until the judge made a final ruling. I felt relief and fear at the same time because having River's support mattered, but we still had to get through a hearing where Brett would try to tear everything apart. 2 days later, Thomas called to say Brett's lawyer filed a motion to dismiss River's report. The motion claimed she was biased against fathers and didn't properly consider Brett's perspective. It included statements from Brett saying I poisoned the evaluation by lying about him to his family first. Thomas said we had a hearing on the motion next week, and he was confident the judge would deny it, because Rivers' report was thorough and based on interviews with multiple people. I spent the next week barely sleeping, running through worst-case scenarios where the judge threw out Rivers' report and gave Brett unsupervised access to Leo. The hearing was short. Brett's lawyer argued that River only listened to my side and Janet's guilty conscience, not to Brett's explanations about normal discipline. Thomas presented Rivers' interview notes showing she gave Brett multiple chances to explain his actions, and he spent most of the time blaming me. The judge denied the motion and said Rivers' methodology was sound. Thomas whispered that this meant we were in a strong position going into the final hearing. Brett stared at me from across the courtroom with pure hatred in his eyes. That afternoon, I went to the bank to apply for a loan. My credit wasn't great and I had almost no savings, but I needed money to cover Thomas's fees for the final hearing plus 2 months of mortgage payments. The loan officer looked at my application and offered me a personal loan at 18% interest. The number made my stomach drop, but I signed the papers anyway. I would be paying it off for years, probably longer than Leo would remember this whole nightmare, but keeping a roof over his head mattered more than my credit score. Walking out of the bank, I felt the weight of the debt settle onto my shoulders along with everything else. Thomas scheduled a prep session for the following week. The final custody hearing was set for 3 weeks out, which meant 3 more weeks of living in limbo. He warned me that Brett's lawyer would try to make me look manipulative and unstable by bringing up how I lied to Brett's family. I needed to be ready to explain why I did it without sounding vindictive or crazy. We spent 2 hours going over potential questions and my answers. Thomas kept stopping me when I got defensive or emotional, reminding me that the judge needed to see me as stable and focused on Leo's well-being. By the end, I felt wrung out and terrified of saying the wrong thing on the stand. Janet called that evening while I was making dinner. Her voice sounded tired and sad. She said Robert finally admitted he was too hard on Brett and Kyle when they were growing up. He wouldn't testify or make any public statements, but he told Brett to stop fighting the custody case and focus on fixing himself instead. Janet said it was the closest thing to accountability she'd ever heard from Robert in 40 years of marriage. I thanked her for telling me, and she said she wished she'd listened when I first tried to explain what Brett was doing to Leo. After we hung up, I stood at the stove stirring pasta and crying because even that small admission from Robert felt like a victory I'd been fighting for since Leo was born. The school counselor called 2 days before the final hearing. Her voice was shaking. She said Brett showed up at Leo's school during pickup that afternoon, even though the restraining order specifically prohibited it. I wasn't there because Georgia was handling pickup while I worked a day shift. The counselor saw Brett walking toward the line of parents and immediately called the office. They kept Leo inside while the counselor went out to document what was happening. Brett was standing by the fence watching kids come out, scanning for Leo. When the counselor approached him, he claimed he forgot about the restraining order and just wanted to see his son. She told him he needed to leave immediately, or she would call the police. Brett argued for a few minutes, then finally walked away when another teacher came outside. The counselor called the police anyway and filed a report. She sent me a copy of her documentation along with statements from 2 other staff members who witnessed it. I called Thomas from the hospital parking lot, and he said he would file an emergency motion about the violation. The hearing on Brett's violation happened the next morning. I had to call in sick to work again, which meant losing another day's pay I couldn't afford. The judge looked angry when Thomas presented the school counselor's report and the police documentation. Brett's lawyer tried to claim it was an honest mistake, that Brett was driving by the school and stopped without thinking. Thomas pointed out that Brett had to the park, walk to the fence, and stand there for several minutes before being confronted. The judge wasn't buying the honest mistake defense. She issued a formal warning to Brett and extended the restraining order for another 6 months. She said any future violations would result in immediate consequences, including possible jail time. Brett's lawyer tried to argue, but the judge cut him off. I watched Brett's face turn red as he realized his case was falling apart in real time. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt something like hope for the first time in months. Thomas called me that evening after Brett's lawyer sent over the settlement offer. We spent 3 hours on the phone going through every detail and what it would mean for Leo's safety. Thomas walked me through the trial option first, explaining how we'd present Rivers' evaluation and the documented restraining order violation. He said our case was strong, but trials were unpredictable, and judges sometimes gave parents second chances even when the evidence was clear. The legal fees would run another $15,000 at minimum, maybe more if Brett's lawyer dragged things out with motions and delays. I'd already borrowed money I couldn't afford to pay back, and my credit cards were maxed out from covering basic expenses while paying Thomas. Then there was Leo to consider. Thomas said trials meant Leo might have to testify or at least be interviewed again by another court evaluator. More strangers asking him scary questions about his dad. More nights lying awake worrying about what would happen. More therapy sessions processing the stress of it all. But accepting the settlement felt like giving Brett exactly what he wanted after everything he'd done to our son. Thomas pointed out that the settlement included mandatory therapy and parenting classes, which was more than some fathers got. The supervised visitation meant Leo would be protected during any contact. Still, I kept thinking about Brett's face in court when the judge warned him about the restraining order violation. He looked angry, not sorry. not like someone who understood what he'd done wrong. I asked Thomas what would stop Brett from finishing his 6 months of therapy, and then going right back to his old ways once the supervision ended. Thomas was quiet for a minute before admitting there were no guarantees. The system couldn't force Brett to actually change, only to complete the required programs. We could write in provisions that gave me some control over the timeline, though. I told Thomas I wanted Leo's therapist to have approval power over any visitation changes. If Alexis didn't think Leo was ready, or didn't believe Brett had made real progress, then the supervision would continue regardless of what Brett's therapist said. Thomas said he'd push for that language in the settlement modifications. I also wanted the therapy requirement extended to at least 6 months, not the 3 months Brett's lawyer suggested. 6 months was barely enough time to scratch the surface of Brett's issues, but it was better than 3. Thomas made notes and said he'd send over the modified terms in the morning. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the settlement paperwork until the words blurred together. Georgia came over around 10 because I'd texted her that I couldn't sleep. She brought coffee and sat with me while I explained the whole situation. Georgia asked what my gut was telling me, and I admitted I didn't trust my gut anymore after missing all the signs of Brett's abuse for so long. She pointed out that I did eventually see what was happening and took action to protect Leo, which was more than a lot of parents did. We talked until midnight before she headed home, and I finally crawled into bed next to Leo, who'd fallen asleep in my room again. The next morning, I called Thomas and told him to accept the settlement with my modifications. He said he'd contact Brett's lawyer right away and get everything in writing. 2 days later, Thomas called to say Brett's lawyer agreed to the terms. 6 months minimum therapy, Leo's therapist approval required for any visitation expansion, continued supervised visits until both therapists signed off. Thomas scheduled the court date to finalize everything and make it an official order. I felt relief mixed with this gnawing anxiety that Brett would find some way around the requirements or just go through the motions without actually changing. The court date arrived on a Tuesday morning. I had to take another day off work, which my supervisor wasn't happy about, but there was no choice. Thomas met me outside the courtroom and went over what would happen. The judge would review the settlement terms, ask if we both agreed, then sign the order making it legally binding. Brett showed up with his lawyer looking stiff in a suit that seemed too tight around his shoulders. He wouldn't look at me while we waited for the judge. When our case was called, we all stood before the bench while the judge read through the settlement agreement. She asked Brett's lawyer if his client understood and accepted all terms. Brett's lawyer said yes. The judge asked me the same question, and I said yes even though my voice shook. The judge signed the order and said it was now in effect. Brett would begin his parenting class within 2 weeks and start individual therapy within 30 days. All visitation would remain supervised until both therapists provided written approval for expansion. Any violation of the order would result in immediate consequences, including possible suspension of all visitation rights. The judge looked directly at Brett when she said that last part. Brett's jaw was clenched and his face had that red tint it got when he was holding back anger. His lawyer put a hand on his arm like a warning to stay quiet. I watched Brett struggle to keep his expression neutral, while the judge explained that this was his opportunity to learn better parenting approaches and rebuild a healthy relationship with his son. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in months, like I could finally breathe without worrying about the next court date or legal bill. Thomas shook my hand and said to call him if Brett violated any terms of the order. I drove home and picked up Leo from Georgia's house. He was building a tower with blocks on her living room floor and barely looked up when I arrived. Leo asked that evening during dinner if he had to see Daddy now that court was done. I put down my fork and explained the new rules as simply as I could. Daddy had to take special classes to learn better ways to be a parent. He had to talk to a therapist about his feelings and his choices. When Daddy was ready to have visits, someone would always be there watching to make sure everyone stayed safe. The visits would be short at first, maybe just an hour, and if Leo felt scared or uncomfortable, he could tell the supervisor and they'd help him. Leo pushed his peas around his plate and asked if the supervisor would really stop Daddy from getting mad. I promised that the supervisor's whole job was keeping kids safe during visits. Leo seemed relieved by that, but then asked why 8-year-olds needed someone to protect them from their parents. The question hit me like a punch to the stomach because he was right. Kids shouldn't need protection from the people who were supposed to love them most. I told him that some parents make mistakes and need help learning how to be better, and that it was okay for him to feel confused or sad or angry about the whole situation. He nodded and went back to eating his dinner. Later that night, I heard him talking to his stuffed dinosaur about the new rules, explaining them in his own words like he was trying to make sense of it all. I picked up every extra shift the hospital offered now that the custody case was settled, and I wasn't paying Thomas anymore. Money was still incredibly tight with the mortgage, utilities, groceries, Leo's therapy bills, and the loan I'd taken out for legal fees. I worked 3 12-hour shifts one week, then 4 the next, rotating between days and nights depending on what was available. My body felt constantly exhausted, and my brain was foggy from the irregular sleep schedule, but at least we could afford to stay in the house. Georgia continued watching Leo during my night shifts without asking for payment. She said her kids were grown and gone, and she liked having a little one around again. I knew she was just being kind, but I accepted her help because I had no other choice. Leo seemed comfortable at her house, and she always had him fed and in pajamas when I picked him up in the morning. Sometimes I'd find them building elaborate block cities together, or reading books about trains. Georgia never asked Leo questions about Brett or the custody situation. She just let him be a kid, which was exactly what he needed. 3 months crawled by with me working constant overtime and Leo attending therapy twice a week. Alexis sent me updates after each session saying Leo was making progress but still struggled with anxiety and trust. Then one afternoon, Alexis called to say Brett had completed his parenting class and started individual therapy. His therapist was sending progress reports to her office so she could monitor his development. I asked if Brett was actually trying or just going through the motions. Alexis said it was hard to tell this early, but the reports indicated Brett was participating in sessions and completing assigned homework. However, his therapist noted that Brett still had difficulty accepting full responsibility for his actions. He acknowledged that some of his discipline methods were too harsh, but kept insisting he was just doing what his father did to him. He seemed to view himself as a victim of his own upbringing, rather than someone who made choices that hurt his son. I asked Alexis if that meant he wasn't really changing. She explained that change happened slowly, and recognizing patterns was often the first step. Brett might need months or even years of therapy to truly understand the impact of his behavior. For now, she was cautiously monitoring the situation, and would not approve any visitation expansion until she saw more significant progress. Leo started having more good days than bad days around the same time. He began talking about dinosaurs again during dinner, explaining the difference between different species and their hunting patterns. His block structures became more elaborate, with bridges and towers and little cars driving through cities he designed. Alexis told me during one of our parent check-ins that Leo was finally feeling safe enough to be a kid again. The constant hypervigilance was fading, and he was able to focus on playing instead of watching for threats. He still had rough moments, especially when he heard raised voices or sudden loud noises, but they were becoming less frequent. Alexis said this was huge progress considering how severe his trauma responses had been just a few months earlier. I cried in her office because seeing Leo laugh and play and talk about his interests again felt like watching him come back to life. She reminded me that recovery wasn't linear, and there would still be setbacks, but the overall trajectory was positive. Brett's first visit after completing his parenting class happened on a Saturday morning at the visitation center. I dropped Leo off and he grabbed my hand tight before we walked inside. The supervisor met us in the lobby and introduced herself as someone who would be there the whole time to make sure everything went well. Leo looked up at me with wide eyes, and I squeezed his hand before letting him go with the supervisor. I sat in my car in the parking lot for the entire hour, unable to drive away even though I wasn't allowed inside during the visit. When the supervisor brought Leo back out, he looked tired but not terrified. The supervisor pulled me aside and said the visit went better than expected. Brett didn't lecture Leo or criticize him at all. He asked Leo about school and what he'd been building with his blocks. He seemed to be trying different approaches, though he was clearly uncomfortable with being gentle and positive. There were a few moments where the supervisor had to redirect Brett when his tone started getting sharp, but overall he responded well to the coaching. Leo was quiet on the drive home. I asked if he was okay and he said Daddy seemed different, less angry. He said it was weird having someone else in the room watching them, but it made him feel safer. That night, Leo had a nightmare and crawled into my bed shaking. Progress wasn't a straight line. I started seeing my own therapist the following week to deal with everything I'd been shoving down for months. The guilt over not protecting Leo sooner ate at me constantly. I kept replaying moments where I should have seen what Brett was doing, should have stepped in, should have left earlier. My therapist listened while I listed all my failures as a mother. Then she asked if I would judge another parent the same way if they were in my situation. I said no, of course not, because abuse was designed to be hidden and manipulative. She pointed out that I was holding myself to an impossible standard. Recognizing mistakes was different from drowning in them. I was learning to forgive myself, which was harder than I expected. We also talked about my manipulation of Brett's family. I felt ashamed of the lies I'd told and the way I'd used their own tactics against them. My therapist helped me understand that I was desperate to protect my son and use the tools I had available. It didn't make the manipulation right, but it didn't make me a terrible person either. I was doing the best I could with limited options and no support system. Over time, I started to separate the guilt that served me from the guilt that just weighed me down. 6 months after that Thanksgiving dinner when everything exploded, Leo told Alexis during a therapy session that he felt safer now. Alexis called me afterward to share what he'd said. Leo still had nightmares sometimes, usually about disappointing people or being in trouble. He got anxious around angry voices and needed extra reassurance when plans changed unexpectedly. But he was starting to trust that I wouldn't let anyone hurt him. He was beginning to believe that he deserved to feel safe and that his feelings mattered. Alexis said this was huge progress for a kid who'd spent months thinking he was the problem. She reminded me that trauma recovery took years, not months, and Leo would likely deal with the effects of Brett's abuse well into adulthood. But right now, in this moment, he was healing. He was learning that the world could be safe and that people could be trusted. He was becoming a kid again instead of a scared little boy constantly trying to avoid punishment. Janet showed up at our apartment on a Saturday morning with a huge wrapped box under her arm. Leo was building a tower with his blocks in the living room, and froze when he saw her through the window. I opened the door, and Janet looked older than I remembered, like the last few months had worn her down. She asked if she could talk to Leo, and I almost said no, but something about her face made me step aside. Leo stayed on the floor, watching her with wide eyes as she set the box down and knelt in front of him. She told him she was sorry for not believing him when he needed help. She said she was wrong to defend his father's behavior, and wrong to think that being tough meant being mean. Leo didn't say anything, just stared at his hands. Janet opened the box and pulled out dinosaurs, dozens of them, all different kinds. She told Leo she remembered which ones Brett threw away, and tried to find the same ones. She promised that if Leo ever felt scared again, she would believe him no matter what. Leo looked at the dinosaurs for a long time, then reached out and touched a triceratops. He picked it up and held it close to his chest, and then he leaned forward and hugged Janet. She wrapped her arms around him and started crying, and I had to leave the room because I couldn't watch without falling apart myself. 2 weeks later, Brett's therapist sent a report to Alexis recommending longer visits. Brett had completed 12 sessions and was showing progress in recognizing harmful patterns. The therapist thought 2-hour visits twice a week would help Brett practice new parenting skills, while still keeping Leo safe. Alexis called me to discuss it, and I felt my stomach drop. Part of me wanted to say no, to keep the visits short forever, but Alexis reminded me that Leo needed to see his father could change. Leo was nervous when I told him about the new schedule. He asked if someone would still be watching, and I promised the supervisor would be there the whole time. I drove him to the first extended visit and sat in the parking lot for 2 full hours, checking my phone every few minutes. When the supervisor brought Leo out, he looked tired but okay. She said Brett asked Leo about school and his favorite dinosaurs, and only got frustrated once when Leo took too long answering. The supervisor redirected him and Brett apologized, which was something I never heard him do before. I wanted to feel hopeful, but all I could think was that real change took years, not months, and we were only at the beginning. The mortgage payment was due in 3 days, and I was short again. I spent an entire evening on the phone with different banks trying to refinance. Most of them said my credit score was too low after taking out the loan for legal fees. One bank finally agreed to a refinance that would lower my monthly payment by $200 and let me roll the legal loan into the mortgage. The interest rate wasn't great, and I would be paying it off for 30 years instead of 15, but it meant I could afford groceries and Leo's therapy without choosing between them. I signed the paperwork online at midnight and felt like I could breathe for the first time in months. It wasn't perfect, and I would be dealing with debt forever, but at least I wasn't drowning anymore. At least I could make it to next month without panic attacks over the bank account. A year after that Thanksgiving dinner when everything exploded, Leo brought home a report card with mostly A's and 1 B. His teacher wrote a note saying he participated in class discussions and made friends easily. Alexis told me his trauma responses were still there but much less intense. He had nightmares maybe once a month instead of every night. He didn't hide when doors slammed or voices got loud. Brett's visits happened every week without incident, and he was learning to parent without criticism or punishment. He would never be the father Leo deserved, but he was becoming someone Leo didn't fear. Our marriage was over in every way that mattered, even though we weren't divorced yet. I was exhausted all the time from working extra shifts and managing everything alone. The financial stress never really went away, just became something I lived with instead of something that crushed me. But Leo was safe. He was healing. He knew I would protect him and that his feelings mattered. We were building something new where he didn't have to earn love or avoid punishment. That was enough for now.